Have you ever been sitting somewhere completely mundane?
Like waiting in line at the grocery store.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Or maybe you're on a crowded bus or just working away at a corner table in a cafe, and suddenly you feel this undeniable, almost electric prickle on the back of your neck.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean.
Right. You didn't hear sound, you didn't catch any movement in your peripheral vision, but you know with absolute certainty that someone is looking at you.
And so you turn around.
You turn around and instantly you lock eyes with a total stranger who is staring right at the back of your head. I mean, it is a nearly universal human experience.
It really is.
It's deeply eerie, it's immediate, and crucially, and this is what we're getting into today, it defies absolutely everything we are taught in standard biology about how our human senses are supposed to work. Like, why does that happen? How is it physically possible to feel a look?
It's one of those everyday mysteries that most of us are just conditioned to brush off.
Just a coincidence, right?
It's exactly a coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe a trick of confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
We ignore it because the alternative, the idea that we can actually feel someone's focused attention across empty physical space, well, it completely breaks the established rules of classical physics and standard biology.
Right.
But what if the rules we've been playing by for the last few centuries are, fundamentally incomplete? What if that prickle on the back of your neck isn't a glitch in your brain, but actually a tiny, perceptible ripple in an invisible web that connects all living things?
And that exact question is the mission of our deep dive today. We are unpacking this really extensive, truly mind-bending interview from the Dutch channel De Nieuwe Aarde, featuring the biologist and author Dr. Rupert Sheldrake.
It's a fascinating interview.
It really is. Our goal today is to explore a framework that directly challenges the traditional mechanistic view of science. We're going to look at how nature forms its shapes, how memory actually operates, and this is the wild part where the boundaries of your very own mind might actually end.
It is a journey. We're going from the development of sea urchins to the statistical anomalies of crossword puzzles,
Yes.
all the way to telepathic nursing mothers and the deep archetypes of the collective unconscious.
It's a lot. But okay, let's unpack this. Because if we're going to dive into theories that challenge the absolute bedrock of modern science, we need to know exactly who is guiding us on this journey. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake is not, he's not just a casual armchair philosopher throwing out wild guesses on the internet.
Far from it.
He is a highly trained, deeply credentialed biologist and biochemist. He studied at Cambridge University. He studied at Harvard.
Right. He spent years deeply embedded in the most prestigious academic institutions in the world, doing hardcore standard biological research.
Exactly. But while he was specializing in developmental biology, specifically looking at how plants grow and take their shape, he hit a massive wall. He realized that the existing scientific paradigm simply could not explain the mysteries he was documenting right in front of him in the laboratory.
And establishing that academic background is crucial for you, the listener, to understand. Sheldrake often operates outside traditional university walls these days. And because his theories challenge the core tenets of materialist science, he's frequently labeled by his harshest critics as a pseudoscientist.
Which is such a dismissive label.
It is, and it ignores his actual output. I mean, he is an active, peer-reviewed researcher. He's published dozens of papers in legitimate scientific journals. He's also the author of The Science Delusion, which is a rigorous, methodical critique of modern scientific dogmas.
He understands the rules of the scientific method intimately.
He does. He just happens to be applying them to investigate phenomena that mainstream institutions are often highly reluctant to touch.
Which makes analyzing his work so incredibly fascinating. So let's start where he started his journey of questioning things, the massive puzzle regarding how living things actually take their shape.
Developmental biology.
Right. Now, if you ask most people with a standard education how a tiny acorn knows how to become a massive, complex oak tree, or how a single fertilized egg cell knows how to divide and eventually become a human being, the default answer is always the same.
It's all in the genes.
Exactly. DNA is the blueprint. But Sheldrake argues that this is actually a massive overstatement of what DNA actually does, right?
It is a profound overstatement, according to his analysis. The current molecular biology approach is heavily reductionist.
Right.
It attempts to reduce all the complex, holistic mysteries of life down to the microscopic interactions of molecules.
Just dead matter bumping into each other.
Right. But if you actually look at what genes do, strictly and mechanically speaking, they do not contain a geometric blueprint. Genes code for the sequence of amino acids to build proteins.
Okay.
Some genes act as switches, turning other protein-building genes on or off. And that is the extent of their function. They manufacture the right proteins at the right time.
But having the right proteins doesn't magically explain how those proteins suddenly know how to arrange themselves into the highly complex three-dimensional shape of an oak leaf.
Or an orchid petal.
Or the incredibly intricate structure of a developing animal's eyeball. The analogy Sheldrake uses for this really clarifies the limitation of the DNA as blueprint idea for me.
The house building analogy.
Yes. Think about building a complex structure, like a Victorian house. To build that house, you need raw materials. You need bricks, you need cement, reinforcing steel, timber, glass.
All the parts.
Right. Genes, in this analogy, are the factories that produce all those building materials. They give you the bricks and the wood. But if you just dump a massive pile of bricks, wood, and glass onto an empty lot,
those materials do not spontaneously assemble themselves into a Victorian mansion.
no matter how good the quality of the bricks is, to actually build the house, you need an architect's plan. You need a blueprint that exists independently of the materials, which organizes those raw materials into a specific structured form.
And Sheldrake's point is that the genes perfectly explain the materials, but they fundamentally do not explain the form, the shape, or the overarching behavior of the organism.
And that realization that a pile of proteins doesn't explain a living, shape-led Sheldrake to look backward into the history of biology for alternative explanations. He didn't just invent a solution out of thin air, did he?
No, not at all. In the 1920s, there was a minority school of developmental biology that recognized this exact same problem and developed a more holistic approach. Thinkers like Alexander Gurvich and others proposed the existence of what they called morphogenetic fields.
Morphogenetic.
Right. The term literally translates to form-shaping fields.
Okay, form shaping.
The core idea was that developing organisms are shaped by invisible organizing fields that work from the top down. They act as a kind of spatial mold, rather than the organism merely assembling itself mechanically from the bottom up through blind molecular interactions.
And because the word field can sound super abstract, especially to anyone outside of a physics classroom, the easiest way to visualize what Sheldrake is talking about is to think of a simple bar magnet.
That's a great way to picture it.
Yeah, if you take a magnet and you sprinkle a bunch of iron filings onto a piece of paper resting over it, what happens? The iron filings don't just sit there in a random chaotic pile. They immediately and aggressively arrange themselves into a beautiful, structured geometric pattern.
They line up perfectly along the invisible lines of magnetic force.
Exactly. Now, you cannot see the magnetic field itself with your naked eye, but you can clearly, undeniably see its organizing effect on the physical matter caught within it.
And Sheldrake is suggesting that a developing leaf or a developing animal embryo has a kind of invisible shape-holding field around it that acts exactly like that magnetic field.
Organizing the growing cells into their proper places.
Right. It is a very elegant way to conceptualize a holistic principle. And Sheldrake relies on this concept because it perfectly explains some of the most bizarre, seemingly miraculous phenomena in biology that strict bottom-up reductionism completely fails to answer.
Like the sea urchins.
Yes, he points to the classic experiments with sea urchin embryos as a prime example of this top-down organizing principle.
The sea urchin example is wild. Okay, so researchers found that if you take a developing sea urchin embryo at a very early stage of its cellular development, and you literally take a microscopic tool and physically cut that embryo perfectly in half.
Which sounds destructive.
It does. Now, if the organism was just a machine, if it was just a bottom-up chemical construction project where every cell is a mechanical gear, cutting it in half should logically result in two deformed half urchins.
Or more likely just a dead, inert pile of cells.
Right, the machine should be broken. But that is not what happens at all. If you cut the embryo in half, each individual half radically reorganizes itself and develops into a fully complete, fully functioning, just slightly smaller sea urchin.
Which, to bring it back to your analogy, is exactly what happens when you cut a bar magnet in half.
Oh, wow. Yes.
If you snap a magnet, you do not end up with one isolated piece of metal that is only a north pole and another piece that is only a south pole. The moment it snaps, you immediately end up with two complete smaller magnets, each instantly generating its own complete whole magnetic field.
That's so cool.
Sheldrake argues that the morphogenetic field of the sea urchin operates the exact same way. It is a holistic entity. It cannot be broken into mechanical pieces.
So when the physical matter is disrupted,
The invisible field simply reestablishes itself over the remaining matter and guides those cells to form the complete whole.
It makes an intuitive kind of sense when you look at how resilient embryonic development can be.
Yeah.
But if we follow Sheldrake down this path and accept that these form-shaping fields might actually exist, and we should note there are mainstream biologists today doing highly respected work on bioelectric fields that guide cell growth.
Yes, like Michael Levin's work at Tufts.
Exactly. But if we accept this, we run into the next massive philosophical hurdle. Where do these fields actually come from? Who or what is generating the blueprint?
This raises an important question, and it's arguably one of the most fundamental questions in the philosophy of science. What gives the morphogenetic field its specific shape in the first place? Why did the field for an oak tree shape an oak tree and not a pine tree?
Right.
Sheldrake identifies two main philosophical camps here. The first camp is the standard underlying assumption of almost all modern scientists, even the ones who proudly claim to be strict, hard-nosed materialists. Sheldrake argues that secretly, whether they are conscious of it or not, the vast majority of modern scientists are Platonists.
Okay, let's unpack that for the listener, because
Yeah.
secret Platonist is a great phrase, but what does it actually mean for someone who hasn't brushed up on ancient Greek philosophy recently?
Platonism, in the context of modern science, is the deeply held belief that the fundamental laws of nature, the mathematical equations that govern physics, chemistry, and by extension biology, are eternal.
Meaning they never change.
Exactly. The assumption is that these laws exist outside of space and time. They're transcendent. The materialist view essentially dictates that all the laws of physics and the potential for all biological forms were completely locked in at the exact microscopic fraction of a second the Big Bang occurred.
So they've just been waiting around.
Right, these eternal laws have just been floating in some abstract mathematical realm ever since, waiting for matter to obey them. But Sheldrake points out a massive, fatal flaw in this logic when you attempt to apply it to the messy reality of biological evolution.
Right, because if the laws of nature and the blueprints for form are eternal and have been completely unchanging since the moment of the Big Bang, that leads to a ridiculous conclusion.
What's that?
Well, it means that the specific morphogenetic field, the exact mathematical blueprint for an oak tree or a velociraptor or a modern human being, existed 14 billion years ago.
Ah, I see.
The exact equation for a dinosaur's physical shape was just waiting around in the cold vacuum of the universe billions of years before a single star even formed, let alone a planet with carbon-based life.
It doesn't make intuitive sense.
No. If that is true, it means biology isn't actually historical at all. It means evolution isn't a creative process. It's just blind matter finally stumbling into pre-existing eternal blueprints that were always there.
Exactly. And Sheldrake rejects that transcendent view entirely. He argues that biology is radically evolutionary and deeply intrinsically historical. What happens in biology today absolutely depends on what has successfully happened before.
Okay.
And this philosophical shift is what leads directly to his most famous and definitely most controversial contribution, the theory of morphic resonance.
Morphic resonance.
Yes. He proposes that these form-shaping fields are not eternal static mathematical laws. Instead, they are evolving, and they possess an inherent memory. And that memory comes directly from previous organisms of the exact same kind.
This is where the paradigm completely flips on its head. Sheldrake says that nature does not have eternal, unbreakable laws. Rather, nature has habits.
Habits, yes.
Each species has a kind of collective memory bank. Every individual organism contributes its life experience to this memory as it lives, and it also continuously draws upon it to guide its own development and behavior. It's a cumulative, ever-growing field of memory.
And the most radical part is how this memory is transmitted.
Right. It isn't transmitted through physical contact or through chemical signals in the DNA. It is transmitted across time and space through similarity.
That is the crucial foundational mechanism of Sheldrake's entire framework. Similarity. He argues that biological inheritance isn't just about inheriting a physical sequence of DNA from your parents.
Okay.
It isn't even just about epigenetics, the relatively recent discovery of how environmental factors can switch certain genes on and off.
Which is fascinating in its own right.
It is. And while those physical mechanisms definitely exist, Sheldrake argues that a massive, unrecognized part of inheritance is an organism literally tuning into the morphic resonance of past organisms of its exact same species.
Tuning in almost like a radio.
Exactly. And the most compelling part of his argument is that he insists this is not just abstract philosophy. He insists it is a testable, empirical scientific theory.
So let's look at the real-world data and experiments he brings up to support this. Because this is where the theory leaves the realm of pure thought and hits the laboratory pavement. Sheldrake talks about a series of experiments involving rats learning mazes.
This is a classic example.
He explains that if you take a specific breed of rats in a laboratory, let's say in Amsterdam, and you train them to learn a brand new, highly specific, complex trick, maybe it's navigating a novel type of water maze to find a hidden platform.
Something they wouldn't normally do.
Right. It takes the first generation of rats a long time to learn it. But once those rats in Amsterdam have fully mastered the trick, Sheldrake argues that a new morphic field for that specific behavior is established in the collective memory of that breed.
The habit has been formed.
Yes, and here is the kicker. If you take a completely different group of rats of the exact same breed, in a laboratory in London or New York or Sydney rats, with absolutely zero physical, geographical, or genetic connection to the Amsterdam rats.
They should inherently learn that exact same water maze trick significantly faster.
Exactly.
And according to the historical data Sheldrake cites from early 20th century lab experiments, that is exactly what happened.
It's wild.
The data showed a progressive increase in the speed of learning across generations, even in isolated control groups that had no genetic link to the trained rats.
Because, in Sheldrake's framework, the habit had already been carved out in the morphic field of that specific rat species.
The initial rats in Amsterdam did the heavy lifting of forming the new behavioral pathway, and now all subsequent rats of that precise breed can essentially resonate with that established memory, making the learning process dramatically easier.
And he points out that we see this phenomenon not just in controlled lab settings, but happening spontaneously in the wild, like the orca phenomenon.
All right, the boats.
Anyone paying attention to the news recently saw the bizarre story about the orcas suddenly learning how to coordinate and physically tip over luxury sailboats off the coast of Europe.
It was everywhere.
It apparently started with one small specific group of orcas interacting with boats, but then almost overnight, completely separate, geographically isolated pods of orcas all over the world suddenly started exhibiting the exact same highly complex, novel behavior.
Traditional marine biology really struggles to explain how that complex tactical information transferred globally so fast without direct physical communication or migration.
Morphic resonance provides a direct mechanism. The initial habit was formed, the collective field of the species shifted, and other orcas globally simply tuned into it based on their inherent similarity to the original group.
And Sheldrake is quick to point out that this doesn't just apply to animal behavior. It applies to human behavior in cognition just as vividly.
Right. He talks about the crossword puzzle.
In the interview, he mentions a fascinating statistical phenomenon regarding the Times crossword puzzle in the UK.
Which is notoriously difficult.
Very difficult.
Yeah.
Designed to truly challenge the intellect. But Sheldrake notes the data suggests solving the Times crossword is actually statistically easier for individuals if they attempt to solve it the day after it is published, rather than struggling with it on the morning it is released.
The implication there is wild. The idea is that because thousands of people struggled through the puzzle, concentrated on the clues, and finally deduced the answers on Tuesday morning.
By Wednesday, the collective morphic field for that specific, unique puzzle has been essentially solved.
The neural pathway of the solution has been heavily blazed into the collective human memory, making it subtly, measurably easier for your brain to resonate with the correct answers a day later.
It is almost like a cognitive slipstream that subsequent problem solvers can write in.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If we follow this logic to its conclusion, if we accept the premise that a rat in London can somehow remember what a rat in Amsterdam learned, or a crossword solver today can unconsciously benefit from the mental effort of a stranger yesterday, it forces us to completely and radically reevaluate the very nature of human memory itself.
Because the standard, unquestioned materialist assumption of modern neuroscience is that memory absolutely must be a physical thing.
Wait, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because this is where the theory encounters massive friction.
Sure.
The scientific consensus is that every memory you have, your childhood birthday party, the lyrics to your favorite song, the motor skills required to ride a bike, is physically stored somewhere inside the meat of your brain.
Like the enneagram.
Neuroscientists are constantly looking for the physical enneagram of memory. They look for modified synaptic connections or changes in RNA or phosphorylated proteins. They treat the human brain like a literal computer hard drive.
A very mechanical view.
So if memory isn't physical, how do we explain something like Alzheimer's disease or someone losing very specific memories after suffering a traumatic physical brain injury? Doesn't the fact that physical brain damage causes memory loss definitively prove that memories are stored in the brain tissue?
It is the most common and vital critique of his work, and Sheldrake addresses it directly. He pushes back against the hard drive metaphor entirely. He argues that just because damaging the brain disrupts memory, that does not definitively prove the memory was stored in the damaged tissue.
Okay, so how does he explain it?
He uses the analogy of a television set.
Let's hear it.
Imagine you are watching a documentary on a television. If you take a hammer and smash the internal components of the TV, the picture will distort, or the audio will cut out, or the screen will go entirely blank. You have physically damaged the machine, and you have lost the program. But crucially, that physical damage does not mean the documentary was stored inside the wires and tubes of your specific television set.
Oh,
The TV is just a receiver. It is a tuning device. The program is a signal being broadcast from elsewhere.
so the brain is the TV.
Exactly. Sheldrake argues the brain operates the exact same way. It is not a storage device. It is a highly complex biological tuning device. When the brain is physically damaged by trauma or Alzheimer's, the tuning mechanism is broken, and the person can no longer tune into the signal of their own past. But the signal of the memory itself remains intact in the morphic field.
That is a fascinating way to reframe the data of brain injury. But it brings up another huge question. If my brain is just a receiver tuning into the morphic field, why do I only remember my life? Why don't I tune into your life or the life of a blacksmith living in 18th century France?
Sheldrake's answer to that brings us right back to his core mechanism, similarity. Morphic resonance depends entirely on how similar the receiver is to the transmitter. The more similar the form and the vibrational pattern, the stronger the resonance. And who, in the entire sprawling history of the universe, is the most physically, genetically, and energetically similar to the you from 5 years ago?
Well, the you of today.
Precisely. You are the single most similar organism to your own past self. Therefore, the morphic resonance between you right now and you in the past is the absolute strongest, clearest signal available to your brain's tuning mechanism.
That makes perfect sense within the framework.
That, according to Sheldrake, is what individual memory actually is. You are simply resonating with your own past states of being. But crucially, because you are also highly similar to your family members genetically, and similar to people in your broader culture, and ultimately similar to the human species as a whole, you also tune into those broader, fainter signals as well.
Which beautifully bridges a massive historical gap in psychology. It provides a biological, scientifically framed mechanism for Carl Jung's famous concept of the collective unconscious. Jung believed that humanity shares a deep, inherited well of archetypes, instincts, and memories. But conventional science has always dismissed Jung's collective unconscious as a purely psychological, almost mystical metaphor, entirely divorced from the physical, biological mechanics of how individual memory works.
And Sheldrake completely unites them.
He suggests that individual memory and the collective unconscious are not totally different phenomena. They are the exact same biological mechanism, morphic resonance, just operating at different degrees of similarity. And he argues it doesn't just apply to human psychology, it applies to rats learning mazes, sea urchins regenerating, and even chemical crystals forming specific, repeating lattice structures.
It is essentially a unified theory of memory for the entire natural world. But obviously walking into a modern university and calmly suggesting that the fundamental storage mechanism of the human brain is an illusion, and that all of nature relies on invisible memory fields.
Probably doesn't make you super popular.
No, it does not make you particularly popular with mainstream biologists. The reaction to his theory really highlights the deep cultural blind spots and rigid paradigms of Western science.
He tells a great story about this in the interview.
He does. He shares a brilliant, highly revealing anecdote about this. When he first formulated this theory, while working at Cambridge University, he excitedly brought it to his academic colleagues. And their reaction was visceral.
They weren't happy.
They weren't just exhibiting healthy scientific skepticism. They were deeply baffled, and in many cases, genuinely emotionally angry. The theory profoundly offended their mechanistic worldview.
But then his career took a fascinating detour. He left Cambridge and went to work as a plant physiologist at an agricultural research institute in Hyderabad, India.
Right.
And when he eventually started explaining his theory of morphic resonance to his Indian scientific colleagues, fully bracing himself for the anger, the mockery, and the intense pushback he had experienced in England, their reaction was entirely comically different.
It was a night and day difference. His Indian colleagues were completely blasé about the entire concept.
They basically yawned.
They essentially yawned and said, well, obviously. There is nothing fundamentally new in this idea. The ancient rishis and seers have said this for thousands of years. Of course, there is memory inherent in nature. It is simply a basic function of karma.
It is such a perfect illustration of how deeply our cultural paradigms dictate what we consider to be acceptable scientific hypotheses. In the West, steeped in the machine universe model of the Enlightenment, the idea of an interconnected memory in nature was treated as an outrageous, almost dangerous heresy.
But in India, steeped in centuries of traditions regarding karma, interconnectedness, and Buddhist philosophy, it was considered a self-evident, almost boring truth about the nature of reality.
Sheldrake actually joked that his core problem in India was the exact opposite of his problem in England. In England, he couldn't get anyone to accept the premise. In India, he had to actively struggle to convince the scientists to actually run empirical experiments to prove it because they felt the concept was far too obvious to waste laboratory time testing.
It's a wonderful sociological observation. But Sheldrake also found philosophical backing for his ideas much closer to home, deeply embedded in the history of European philosophy.
Henri Bergson.
Yes. Before he went to India, while he was obsessively trying to figure out how these form-shaping fields could possibly be inherited, if not through the physical medium of DNA, a colleague pointed him toward a book by the highly influential French philosopher Henri Bergson. The book, published way back in 1898, is called Matter and Memory.
And reading Bergson was a massive revelation for Sheldrake.
Huge.
Because Bergson explicitly argued that memory operates in a completely different fundamental reality than physical matter. He was one of the very first modern Western thinkers to formally propose that memories are not stored anywhere inside the physical brain.
Instead, Bergson argued that memory is not a phenomenon that exists in space at all. You cannot locate a memory with a scalpel. Memory, he proposed, is a relationship in time.
Wow. A relationship in time.
It involves a completely different kind of causation and influence, acting across time at a distance, rather than physical objects pushing against each other in space.
It is an incredibly poetic and philosophically dense idea. But naturally, the hardcore materialists in the scientific community have a massive, screaming objection to this entire line of reasoning. When presented with morphogenetic fields and resonance across time, their immediate, demanding question is always, if these fields are real, show me the matter. What are they actually made of?
Which is a fair question. If you're proposing a new biological force, people want to know what the force consists of. But Sheldrake pushes back against this criticism by pointing directly to the untouchable, foundational pillars of modern physics, gravity, and electromagnetism. He essentially argues that physics gets away with things that biology is punished for.
Oh, I love this part of his argument.
His defense relies heavily on the history of physics. If you walk into any university physics department today and ask a professor, what is a gravitational field actually made of? They fundamentally cannot give you a material answer.
Really?
Really. When Isaac Newton first proposed the universal theory of gravity, he actually had absolutely no idea how a piece of physical matter like the sun could possibly attract another piece of physical matter like the Earth across millions of miles of completely empty dead space. It made zero mechanical sense in the physics of his day.
Because there's nothing connecting them.
Exactly. In his private letters, Newton admitted it seemed absurd. He secretly hypothesized that empty space was the sense organ of God, and that God's infinite, omnipresent power was what was actually pushing the planets together.
And then, centuries later, Albert Einstein comes along and completely revolutionizes the concept with general relativity. He removes God from the equation and says gravity isn't a pulling force traveling through space at all. It is the physical warping of space-time itself. The mass of a planet bends the fabric of the universe.
But even then, as Sheldrake points out, and as actual physicists who have been guests on the To New World podcast have openly admitted, one of the biggest unresolved mysteries in physics today is what exactly makes mass warp space-time.
Right.
Nobody actually knows what the gravitational field is fundamentally made of. They just observe the effects of what it does. If I drop a pen, it falls to the floor, the field acts upon the matter, and we measure the result, even if the medium of the field remains a mystery.
And Sheldrake argues it is the exact same historical story with electromagnetism. When Michael Faraday first proposed the existence of electric and magnetic fields to explain his experiments, he couldn't explain what the fields were made of.
He theorized they must be made of some subtle, invisible, all-pervading matter called the ether.
Right. Then James Clerk Maxwell wrote his famous foundational equations of electromagnetism, explicitly assuming this physical ether was real. But then Einstein came along and proved the ether doesn't exist. The fields aren't made of anything physical at all.
Today, standard quantum electrodynamics says that electromagnetic interactions are mediated by virtual photons popping in and out of a zero-point energy field. But by strict physical definition, a virtual photon is entirely unobservable,
Nobody has ever seen one.
and nobody ever will.
What's fascinating here is the massive double standard that Sheldrake perceives. Physics is routinely allowed to invent entirely unobservable entities to make their complex mathematical equations work. Look at the concept of dark matter.
Oh yes, dark matter is the perfect example.
Cosmologists realized decades ago that their equations for how galaxies form and hold together completely fell apart based on the amount of visible matter they could actually see in the universe. The math didn't work, so what did they do? They hypothesized dark matter.
Just invented it to balance the books.
Exactly. They currently claim it makes up roughly 5 times the amount of normal observable matter in the entire universe. And yet, it has never been observed, it does not interact with light, and there is zero independent physical evidence for its existence. It is literally obscure matter. They simply need it to exist to balance their cosmic ledger.
And this is the crux of Sheldrake's frustration. Physicists are walking around confidently talking about unobservable virtual photons, 11-dimensional superstring fields, and invisible dark matter that comprises the vast majority of the universe, and they're ahead to Nobel Prizes.
But the second a biologist like Sheldrake says, hey, maybe there is an invisible, non-material field that shapes a developing plant or guides animal behavior, the scientific establishment immediately screams, pseudoscience! You can't put it in a test tube.
Right. Sheldrake is arguing that biology should be afforded the exact same theoretical latitude as physics. We should be allowed to study what morphic fields do and measure their effects empirically, even if we don't currently have a perfectly unified mathematical theory of what they fundamentally are.
We use electric motors every single day, relying entirely on electromagnetic fields, even though physicists are still debating the fundamental quantum nature of those fields.
It is a very robust defense of his methodology.
Sure.
But we should also clarify something for the listener here. Because when we start talking about a non-physical memory inherent in nature, it is incredibly easy to drift away from science and straight into New Age spirituality.
Very true.
In the interview, the host asks Sheldrake how his theory of morphic resonance relates to the concept of the Akashic Records, which is this popular spiritual idea of a mystical, ethereal database containing the record of all universal events.
And Sheldrake is very careful to draw a firm boundary here. He notes that the term Akashic Records was popularized by Western theosophists in the late 19th century, borrowing heavily from Eastern concepts. But Sheldrake thinks it is actually a terrible, highly misleading metaphor for what he is proposing.
He rejects it entirely because the word record immediately forces the mind to conjure a spatial object.
Like a filing cabinet.
Right. It brings up an image of a giant celestial filing cabinet or a massive cosmic hard drive, or, as Sheldrake jokingly calls it in the interview, a giant iCloud in the sky.
Huh.
It implies that the memories of the universe are physically stored as discrete packets of data on some ethereal server located somewhere in space. But as Sheldrake points out, even our modern computer clouds aren't actually ethereal. They are massive, energy-guzzling physical data centers full of silicon chips, cooling fans, and miles of physical wires.
Exactly. Storing information in a physical medium, whether it's carving hieroglyphs in stone, writing ink on parchment, or saving binary code on a flash drive, is how human cultural memory works in literate societies. It requires space and matter.
But Sheldrake argues that is emphatically not how biological or cosmic memory works.
He reiterates Henri Bergson's central point. Biological memory is a continuous resonance across time, not static data stored in a physical space. Therefore, asking where the morphic field is stored is asking the wrong question entirely. It isn't anywhere in space. It is a direct temporal connection between the past and the present.
But if we accept that premise, if memory isn't physically located inside the brain, it naturally forces us to ask an even bigger, more unsettling question. What about consciousness itself? Where does our mind actually live?
The hard problem.
Yes, and this brings us right up against what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. If the universe is really just dead, unconscious matter blindly obeying mathematical equations, then how on earth did consciousness arise? How does dead meat in a skull suddenly wake up and experience the vibrant color red, or the agonizing feeling of grief, or the bitter taste of black coffee.
Many prominent philosophers of mind and hardcore materialists have spent their entire careers trying to prove that consciousness doesn't actually exist at all, that it is just a stubborn illusion generated by the complex firing of neurons, specifically because the materialist worldview fundamentally has no room for subjective experience.
The bleak view.
The standard scientifically accepted view of how we interact with the physical world is actually deeply bizarre and counterintuitive when you really stop to think about it.
How so?
If you look at a tree outside your window right now, the official scientific explanation is that photons of light bounce off the bark of that tree, travel through the air, enter your eye, hit your retina, send electrical signals down your optic nerve, and then your brain somehow miraculously translates those purely electrical signals into a full-color, three-dimensional virtual reality display of a tree.
Which logically means that, according to mainstream science, the tree you're experiencing right now is not the actual physical tree out there in the world.
Wait, what?
The tree you see is merely a tiny 3D movie of a tree rendering in real time on a neurological screen, trapped inside the dark, completely lightless theater of your skull.
That's horrifying.
Under the strict materialist paradigm, everything you see, everything you feel, and everything you experience is entirely trapped inside your head. You've never actually seen the real world. You've only ever seen your brain's internal simulation of it.
But Sheldrake completely and utterly rejects this virtual reality model of the brain. He argues that it totally contradicts our lived, everyday, phenomenological experience of reality. Every young child, and virtually every human culture outside of modern Western scientific training, intuitively feels that the image they are seeing is exactly where it appears to be out there in the physical world.
So what's his alternative?
Sheldrake's radical proposition is that our minds are not confined to the physical boundaries of our skulls. He argues that our minds literally, physically extend out into the environment around us. When you look at a tree, your mind is actively reaching out through space to touch it. Your visual field is exactly that, an invisible extended field of consciousness projecting out from your physical body.
And if we follow the logical implications of that theory, if your mind physically extends out into the world and actively touches what you are looking at, that means human vision is not just a passive reception of bouncing light. Vision is an active two-way interaction with the environment.
Your gaze actually has a subtle physical presence.
Which brings us all the way back to the very first question we asked at the beginning of this deep dive, the eerie feeling of being stared at.
Yes.
Sheldrake asks the completely logical follow-up question. If my extended mind projects an invisible field out to touch you when I look at you from behind, could your nervous system actually detect the pressure of my mind touching you?
And as we established right at the start, the subjective answer for the vast majority of human beings is a resounding yes. But Sheldrake hasn't just philosophized about this in a library. He has spent decades gathering massive amounts of empirical data to test it.
The Nemo experiment.
Yes. He ran a huge long-term experiment at the Nemo Science Center in Amsterdam. It ran for 25 straight years. It was one of their most popular interactive exhibits, and it was literally called, "Have You Got Eyes in the Back of Your Head?"
The methodology for the experiment was brilliantly simple, which is often the hallmark of good experimental design. A subject sits in a chair, blindfolded, facing a wall. Another person sits behind them. A computerized random number generator dictates whether the person sitting behind should actively stare at the back of the blindfolded subject's head or completely look away and think about something else. After a set period, the blindfolded person simply has to guess, am I being stared at right now or not?
Skeptics immediately argue that phenomena like this are just the result of sensory leakage. Maybe the blindfolded person hears a shift in a chair or the breathing pattern changes when someone stares.
Of course.
But Sheldrake controlled for all of that. They used soundproof glass in later iterations. And over the course of 25 years, with hundreds of thousands of individual trials meticulously gathered and analyzed by an independent statistician at the Free University in Amsterdam, the results were incredibly astronomically significant.
People could tell.
People could consistently tell when they were being observed. The hit rate was far, far above what statistical random chance would dictate. They found that up to 95% of people reported having experienced this feeling in their lives. And fascinatingly, the most highly sensitive subjects in the controlled laboratory setting were consistently children under the age of 9.
Which aligns perfectly with his overall theory. Young children haven't yet been fully conditioned by a strict materialist education to actively ignore or suppress their subtle bodily sensations and natural intuition. They just report what they feel.
That makes a lot of sense.
And this concept of the physical extension of the mind also provides a mechanism for the psychological concept of joint attention.
What's that?
Have you ever seen a parent walking down the street with a toddler, and the parent spots a dog across the street, points at it, and says, "Look, doggy." The parent and the child are suddenly intensely looking at the exact same physical object.
Yeah.
Sheldrake argues that by focusing their extended mental fields on the precise same physical point in space, their minds are literally brought into a kind of energetic resonance and entanglement with each other.
And that concept of mental entanglement gets even deeper and more profound when you look at humans who are deeply biologically bonded, like a mother and her newborn child. This was the specific experimental data that really blew my mind. Sheldrake decided to investigate reports of telepathy in nursing mothers.
This is fascinating.
The physiological background here is that when a mother is breastfeeding, her milk lets down, which is a physical reflex mediated by the release of the hormone oxytocin. Usually, this letdown reflex is triggered by physical proximity to the baby, or specifically by hearing the baby cry.
Okay.
But when a nursing mother returns to the workplace, she is physically separated from her baby, often by many miles. Yet an overwhelming number of mothers consistently report that their milk spontaneously lets down at work at the exact moment their baby suddenly wakes up in distress and needs them at home.
It is a remarkable, deeply reported phenomenon. In the past, mothers would just feel this sudden tingling sensation, intuitively assume their baby needed them, and rush home. But today, with the advent of mobile phones and instant communication, we can actually track it empirically.
Which Sheldrake did.
Sheldrake conducted a rigorous study roughly 25 years ago, right as pagers and early mobile phones were becoming common. He had mothers meticulously log the exact minute their milk suddenly let down at work, and he had the caregivers at home simultaneously log the exact minute the baby woke up distressed and crying for food.
And again, critics argue that this is just biological synchronization. The mother and baby are just on the same internal rhythm. But Sheldrake analyzed the data and showed that the synchronization was staggeringly, statistically significant, even at highly irregular, unpredictable times that completely broke the standard feeding routine.
It wasn't just two clocks ticking at the same speed.
No, it was an active, real-time, non-local, telepathic response to the acute distress of the child.
It is a beautiful illustration of the extended mind functioning at its most primal, essential evolutionary level. The mother and child are bonded so deeply, and their morphic fields are so intimately entangled that they remain connected across vast physical distances.
It's beautiful.
But if we follow the logic of the theory, if the mind can extend out through physical space to touch a distant star, or maintain a connection with a distant child, it logically must follow that the mind can also extend through time.
That perfectly highlights the mechanism he's proposing. But it leaves a massive, complicated gap. If these fields interact with time, how do we explain phenomena that seem to break the linear flow of time entirely?
The weird stuff.
Yeah, that brings us to the really weird stuff the interviewer asked Sheldrake about. Dreams, visions, and altered states of consciousness where the standard filters of the waking, rational brain are temporarily shut down.
The interviewer specifically asks Sheldrake about psychedelics, and Sheldrake is surprisingly candid. He mentions that he first experimented with LSD back in 1970, and while he stresses he isn't a psychedelic maniac advocating for constant use, he freely acknowledges that these substances can dramatically illuminate the hidden nature of the human mind.
He points to the extensive research of Stanislav Grof, right?
Yes, Stanislav Grof, a pioneering, highly credentialed psychiatrist who conducted massive amounts of legal clinical research with LSD in the 60s and 70s.
Grof's findings were fascinating because he discovered some deeply unsettling but incredibly consistent patterns in what his patients were experiencing, especially under very high doses of psychedelics. Many people reported feeling an overwhelming sensation that they were dying. They would describe being trapped in a horrific, crushing situation. They felt physically compressed by an immense, unbearable pressure in a dark, claustrophobic space. This was usually followed by a sensation of being violently pushed through a dark, suffocating tube and finally bursting out into a realm of blinding, peaceful, joyful light.
Which, to anyone familiar with the literature, sounds exactly like a classic near-death experience.
It's an NDE, yeah.
But Grof analyzed the psychological context and realized It wasn't just a hallucination about dying. It was actually a profound recollection of being born. He argued that these patients were tapping into the deep archetypal biological memory of the birth trauma.
Think about it from the infant's perspective. You are floating happily in warm, weightless amniotic fluid for 9 months. Suddenly, the entire world turns violently hostile. The muscular walls of the womb start crushing you. You are squeezed mercilessly through a dark, terrifying birth canal, and then you are thrust out into the glaring, cold light of the world, forced to breathe air for the first time.
It's traumatic.
Very. Groff argued that this trauma is a fundamental, deeply imprinted archetype shared by all of humanity.
And this fits perfectly into Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance. A psychedelic experience, in this framework, essentially acts as a profound chemical rite of passage. It violently disrupts the mundane, waking frequency of the brain, lowering the receiver's filters, and allows the individual's consciousness to tune into a vivid, hyper-real dream state where the deep collective memories of humanity are suddenly directly accessible.
And importantly, Sheldrake notes that it isn't just biological memories like the birth trauma that become accessible. It is deeply cultural, symbolic archetypes as well.
The Ganesh example.
Yes, he uses a fantastic example from his time in India. In India, the elephant-headed god Ganesh is absolutely ubiquitous. You see his image painted on taxis, carved into temples, and in every shop. Consequently, Indian people regularly report dreaming of Ganesh interacting with them.
Which makes sense.
But what is truly mind-blowing and supportive of Sheldrake's theory is that people in the West who have absolutely zero conscious knowledge of Indian culture or Hindu mythology will take a heavy dose of a psychedelic and frequently report interacting with a benevolent, multi-armed, elephant-headed figure.
Wow.
They often only realize what they saw months later when they randomly stumble across an image of Ganesh in a book or online.
It strongly suggests that these archetypes are not just learned cultural symbols passed down through books and stories. They are deeply established forms residing actively within the collective morphic field of humanity. When the brain's filters are lowered, we can spontaneously resonate with those deeply worn grooves in the collective memory, regardless of our individual geographical upbringing.
But then the interviewer pushes Sheldrake on the ultimate, most controversial boundary of this entire concept, precognition, seeing the future. If we can tune into the deep past, can we tune into events that haven't actually happened yet?
It is the natural extreme of the theory. And Sheldrake admits that precognitive dreams and premonitions are absolutely a real, statistically verifiable phenomenon. He actually conducted a fascinating, very rigorous study regarding this right after the tragic events of September 11th, 2001.
It was a very astute, slightly morbid, but brilliant scientific instinct. He realized that if a major, highly emotional, globally traumatic archetypal event was going to trigger precognitive dreams on a mass scale, it would be the planes crashing into the World Trade Center towers.
Yes.
So within mere days of the attacks, before memories could fade or be too heavily corrupted by media narratives, he put out advertisements in New York newspapers like the Village Voice and put up physical posters in Union Square, actively asking people to send in verifiable records of dreams they had strictly before the event occurred.
He was looking for hard evidence, like time-stamped emails or the diary entries, or people who had explicitly told a therapist or a spouse about the dream before the morning of 9/11. And the responses he collected were chilling.
They really were.
He verified 75 heavily documented cases where people had explicitly described the disaster before it happened. And significantly, the dreams fell into 3 highly specific, categorizable archetypes, controlling for general, vague anxieties.
Right. People didn't just dream of something bad happening. The first group dreamed specifically of being inside a commercial airplane that violently crashed into a massive skyscraper. Sometimes their dream featured the Empire State Building, sometimes the Sears Tower in Chicago, but the specific novel action of a plane hitting a tower was central.
Incredible.
The second group dreamed of being trapped inside a burning skyscraper that was structurally collapsing around them. And the third group dreamed of standing in the streets of a major, recognizable metropolis surrounded by a deathly, eerie calm, watching massive, apocalyptic clouds of dust rolling down the avenues, accompanied by an overwhelming, suffocating sense of doom.
The sheer specificity of those documented dreams makes it exceedingly difficult to dismiss them as mere statistical coincidence or standard anxiety dreams. But, and this is a tremendously crucial point for understanding the limits of Sheldrake's intellectual framework, he uses this profound phenomenon to draw a strict, unyielding boundary around his own theory. He openly and clearly states that morphic resonance does not explain these precognitive dreams.
Wait, really? After all that buildup, why not?
Because Sheldrake is very theoretically disciplined. Morphic resonance, by its strict definition, is about the resonance of past habits. It relies on the resonance of forms and behaviors that have already occurred, physically manifested, and established a groove in the collective field.
It only goes one way.
It operates strictly as a one-way street flowing from the past into the present moment. Therefore, morphic resonance mechanically cannot explain a causal influence coming from an event that has not yet actually happened. Sheldrake doesn't fall into the trap of trying to force every single mystery of the universe into his one pet theory.
That's refreshing, actually.
He admits that morphic resonance beautifully explains memory, form, and biological habit. But he freely concedes that it does not explain precognition, it does not explain the true fundamental origin of consciousness itself, and crucially, it does not explain creativity.
Which naturally leads to the biggest question of all. If morphic resonance is only about repeating the past and reinforcing established habits, how does anything genuinely new ever happen in the universe? How do we ever get a new, mutated species of animal, or a groundbreaking new scientific idea, or a totally unprecedented piece of music if the universe is fundamentally just a giant, conservative, habit-repeating machine?
It is the ultimate question of evolutionary biology, and Sheldrake answers it by describing his overarching worldview as super-Darwinian. He believes that the universe itself, at its very core, is fundamentally and prodigiously creative at every single level of existence.
From the spontaneous formation of entirely new chemical crystals to biological genetic mutations, all the way up to the wild heights of human culture, there is a constant, unstoppable fountain of novelty bursting forth.
Right, he points out that nature doesn't just figure out how to make one single efficient kind of beetle and stop there. It aggressively creates millions of different species of beetles. It makes thousands of wildly colorful species of butterflies.
Human beings publish millions of brand new books every single year and release millions of new songs on Spotify. The universe is absolutely exploding with restless creativity, especially whenever an old habit is somehow blocked or a radically new environment is encountered.
But, as Sheldrake notes, if you just have pure, unfiltered, boundless creativity, you end up with total chaos. Nothing ever stabilizes long enough to form a functioning ecosystem or a coherent culture. So natural selection acts as the brutal but necessary filter for that vast, chaotic creativity.
Right.
The reality is that most genetic mutations are actively harmful and the organism dies out. Most of those millions of new songs uploaded every day are terrible, and nobody ever listens to them. But occasionally, a biological mutation is incredibly beneficial to survival. Occasionally, a new song is an absolute pop masterpiece that captures the cultural zeitgeist.
Natural selection filters the raw creativity, and the winners, the successful new biological forms or human behaviors, are then repeated. And the more they are repeated, the stronger their specific morphic field becomes, until that brilliant, fleeting flash of novelty slowly solidifies into a brand new, deeply stable habit of nature.
A combination of boundless, chaotic creativity, harsh natural selection, and stabilizing morphic habit. That is his grand recipe for the universe we live in.
And I love how Sheldrake brings this massive cosmic concept all the way down to a deeply relatable human level by discussing the profound power of human rituals. If repetition strengthens a connection across time, then doing something exactly the same way, using the exact same words and actions across multiple generations, is essentially building a massive superhighway of morphic resonance.
Exactly. This perfectly explains why traditional religious and cultural rituals are inherently stubbornly conservative. They resist change by design.
Take the Jewish feast of Passover, for example. Every single year, Jewish families gather to meticulously reenact the Passover dinner of their ancient ancestors escaping Egypt. They eat the exact same bitter herbs, they recite the exact same prayers in the exact same language, and they tell the exact same story of liberation.
By intentionally participating in this precise physical, verbal, and emotional pattern, Sheldrake argues they are not just remembering an historical event intellectually the way you remember a fact from a textbook.
They are literally, physically resonating with it. They are actively connecting their extended minds with every single person who has ever performed that specific ritual, stretching all the way back through the centuries to the original event.
The American Thanksgiving dinner functions the exact same way on a secular level. By eating the traditional turkey, gathering the same seasonal rhythm, and repeating the familiar family dynamics, you are syncing your consciousness up with the morphic field of the ancestors.
Ritual, in Sheldrake's view, is an incredibly sophisticated psychological technology designed for connecting the present community directly with the deep power of the past.
And Sheldrake explores an even more physical, geographically rooted manifestation of this concept, the ancient practice of pilgrimage. For centuries, across virtually all human cultures, people have felt a deep compulsion to physically walk to sacred places. They journeyed to ancient megaliths like Stonehenge, to towering Gothic cathedrals, to holy wells, or to sacred mountain peaks.
He views these specific structures, the massive upright stones, the cathedral spires reaching into the sky, as literal physical meeting points. They are geographical nodes where the morphic field is unusually dense.
He calls them vertical antennas for the spirit. And for a long time, all of Europe was completely crisscrossed with these ancient walking routes. People would spend months facing real physical danger, just walking to places like Santiago de Compostela in Spain or Canterbury in England.
But then, the Protestant Reformation happened. And Sheldrake notes that in places like England, around 1538, the government abruptly made the act of going on a pilgrimage strictly legally forbidden. They smashed the shrines, burned the relics, and ruthlessly banned the practice.
Which Sheldrake argues sociologically created a massive, aching, unrecognized void in the soul of the Northern European people. The deep, ingrained human need to physically journey to a sacred place, to engage the body in a spiritual quest, and to connect with the morphic resonance of the millions of desperate, hopeful seekers who had walked that exact dirt path before them, didn't just disappear because a king passed a law.
That fundamental human urge was just suppressed and forced underground.
And his theory on how we culturally compensated for that violent suppression is absolutely brilliant. He essentially argues that the suppression of pilgrimage is exactly why the English eventually invented the concept of tourism.
Oh, wow.
He frames modern tourism as just a hollow, deeply secularized version of a spiritual pilgrimage. We still feel that deep, resonant pull to go to the great sacred places of the world. We flock in the millions to Notre Dame or the pyramids of Giza or ancient temples in India.
But because modern secular tourists have entirely lost the framework of ritual when they finally arrive at the sacred destination, they literally don't know what to do with themselves.
Exactly.
They can't kneel down and pray or light a candle or perform a traditional puja because their modern rationalist, materialist mindset tells them that doing so would be silly or superstitious or culturally inappropriate.
That is Sheldrake's sociological critique, yes. He argues that because they lack a ritualistic outlet, they have to pretend they are deeply intellectually interested in the nuances of art history or the engineering of the architecture. And ultimately, because they cannot spiritually engage with the deep resonance of the place, they do the only thing modern culture has taught them to do. They turn their backs to the sacred monument, take a digital selfie to prove to their social network that they are physically there, and then they leave to find a restaurant.
That is painfully accurate. The human soul is crying out for a deep, resonant connection to the history of the land, and the modern ego settles for a photograph.
It's a very provocative, almost tragic way Sheldrake frames modern travel. But the hopeful news he brings up is that the true physical pilgrimage is currently experiencing a massive, entirely unexpected revival in the modern world. People are instinctively waking up to this suppressed need.
Right. He points out that the Camino de Santiago in Spain went from having maybe a few thousand walkers a year back in the 1980s to over 500,000 people walking it last year.
Incredible growth.
And in the UK, the British Pilgrimage Trust, an organization which Sheldrake himself is actually a patron of, is actively working to reopen ancient, overgrown footpaths to holy wells and ruined cathedrals. Millions of people who identify as spiritual but not religious are suddenly flocking to these paths because the simple act of walking the land, physically reconnecting with the rhythms of nature, and literally stepping in the worn footprints of the ancestors is deeply, inherently satisfying to the human organism.
It acts as a profound healing mechanism for the modern sense of disconnection and isolation, which brings us nicely to our final thoughts and the overarching consequences of everything we've unpacked today. Because we have to discuss the ethical and sociological implications of Sheldrake's theory.
Yeah, we can't skip this part.
If morphic resonance is actually real, and if human habits spread invisibly through the collected mental field based purely on repetition, we have a very serious modern crisis to confront. Because morphic resonance itself has absolutely no moral filter.
Right. Gravity doesn't care if it's pulling down a harmless rock or pulling down a person. It just pulls. And morphic resonance doesn't care if it's amplifying a deeply virtuous habit or an incredibly destructive one. And right now, as Sheldrake bluntly points out, the habits that are being repeated most aggressively, millions of times a second on a global scale, are terrible ones.
We have successfully exported hyperconsumerism, vanity, and endless outrage to every single corner of the globe via smartphones and algorithmic advertising.
Sheldrake actually frames this modern dilemma using the traditional Christian concept of the seven deadly sins: pride, envy, lust, gluttony, greed, anger, and sloth. He notes that in ancient philosophy, like Aristotle's view, virtues and sins are not magical curses, they are simply deeply ingrained habits of behavior.
And in the modern world, he argues that social media algorithms are explicitly mathematically designed by engineers to incentivize and constantly amplify those exact seven deadly sins on a daily, minute-by-minute basis.
They systematically train us to be envious of others' curated lives, deeply proud of our own artificial images, greedy for metrics of attention, and constantly angry at perceived outgroups.
According to his theory, we are currently building a massive, highly toxic, incredibly powerful morphic field of bad habits. And because our modern educational systems are almost entirely secular and skills-focused, we have almost entirely stopped teaching the countervailing good habits, the classical virtues of temperance, prudence, courage, and humility.
It is a genuinely terrifying thought, the idea that our private bad habits are silently polluting the invisible mental environment of the entire human species.
Mhm.
But thankfully, Sheldrake doesn't end his interview as a hopeless doomsayer. He doesn't propose trying to solve this modern crisis with strict, puritanical guilt trips, because making people feel deeply ashamed of their behavior almost never actually works to change it.
It doesn't.
Instead, he quotes a psychologist friend of his who coined the absolute perfect slogan for effective modern activism: "If you want to change the world, throw a better party."
It is a profoundly insightful strategy. Sheldrake's point is that you cannot successfully fight the toxic, addictive allure of modern consumerism and digital outrage with drab, miserable asceticism or finger-wagging. You have to actively offer an alternative habit that is genuinely more joyful, more deeply fulfilling, and more resonant with human nature.
Going on pilgrimages,
Yeah.
engaging in meaningful communal rituals, physically reconnecting with the slow rhythms of the natural world, sharing face-to-face meals, these are the better parties.
They are deeply resonant, spiritually satisfying habits that we need to actively, consciously cultivate in order to shift the collective morphic field of humanity back toward genuine connection and sanity.
Throw a better party. I absolutely love that as a guiding philosophy. As we wrap up this incredibly dense deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We've journeyed through some truly paradigm-shattering territory today, exploring ideas that push the very boundaries of how we define reality.
We certainly have. And if Dr. Sheldrake's theoretical framework holds even a fraction of truth, it completely and utterly dismantles the isolated, mechanical view of the human being that we've all been taught. Think deeply about the implications for your own life.
If your precious memories are not physically locked away inside the decaying meat of your brain, but are actually a living, resonant connection across time.
If your vision physically reaches out into the void to gently touch the ancient stars you gaze at in the night sky.
And if your everyday habits, your most private thoughts, and your quietest intentions are silently rippling out right now, influencing strangers across the globe through an invisible web of similarity.
Then the physical boundary of your skin is nothing more than a convenient illusion. You are not a lonely locked box floating aimlessly in a cold, dead, mechanical universe. You are an active, porous, deeply entangled node in a vibrant, living, remembering cosmos.
So the final question we leave you with is this. If your mind truly extends out into the world and your daily habits are actively shaping the collective field of humanity, where does you actually end and the rest of the universe begin? Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the established paradigms, keep exploring the mysteries, and we will catch you on the next one.